Hey everybody, so if you're watching this, either you're trying to get ahead or we have just finished your first 9 weeks and we're about to jump into your second 9 weeks. So let's get through these TEKS for the Roaring 20s. And this video is just going to be for the Roaring 20s, and that's what I hope to do from this point on, is just a video per section of how we're going to break it down and what each TEK is actually talking about and referencing, and maybe just give you a little bit of a review as to what we want our kids to know. So we have our essential TEKS, and that is going to be 6A, 13A, 26A, 16A, and 18C. So we have 5 essential TEKS, and I am going to give you the breakdown and explain why. So 6A is analyze causes and effects of events and social issues such as immigration, social Darwinism, the Scopes trial, eugenics, race relations, nativism, the Red Scare, Prohibition, and the changing role of women. That is a loaded TEK. But the reason that this is one of our essential TEKs is because it covers so many things. And a lot of the stuff, the other TEKs that will be mentioned actually fall into this TEK, like 13A, 5A, 15C, and 20B. So all of those TEKs fall into 6A. And if you properly go over all of what 6A is, then you technically will cover 13A through that 20B. Okay, but now stick with me here. I did separate 13A as an essential TEK. Even though 13A falls into 6A, 13A is technically a topic that should be discussed by itself as well, because it's got a lot going on. So, and it's kind of the prelude to a lot of things that we're going to be discussing later. We've already gotten into the idea of race relations and the things that are going on in the United States during the Progressive Era, and that's going to continue with the Great Migration and Harlem and getting all these things set up, jazz music. This is kind of its own little section within the topic of civil rights and stuff like that with regard to African-American minorities. So with regard to this group, we are going to focus on the Harlem Renaissance because it's always tested. So 13A says, analyze the cause and effect of the changing demographic patterns resulting from migration within the United States, including rural to urban and the Great Migration. I need to start these things earlier in the day because by the end of the day, I'm doing these and I'm yawning. Okay, so that's the Great Migration. But the things that fall into it are 24B, which is Harlem Renaissance, 25C, which is the contributions of people of various racial, ethnic, gender, and religious groups. So you're going to be getting into some actual poetry and stuff like that of famous African Americans during this movement. 6B, you're going to also be talking about Marcus Garvey. 24A is it's the TEK over music, film, and literature, and this is where you're going to be bringing in some of that poetry, but also jazz music as the new music. Okay, so oh my gosh, I'm so tired, guys. I know you're tired too, but let's get on with it. Okay, 26A is going to be your TEK on technology, and this is going to be a major focus too, because there's a lot of concepts within this, even though it's not all mentioned in your TEK right here. But 26A is connected to 27A and let's see, 6B for Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh, but it's also 26C, which is technological innovations in the workplace, such as the assembly line, which goes with Henry Ford, and then 27A. Scientific discoveries, technological innovations, stuff like that. So your other TEKs that we'll focus on is 16A, which is Warren Harding's return to normalcy, reduced taxes, and increased production efficiencies. Actually, this is the first TEK that you will cover when we're moving into the 1920s, because we're leaving World War I. So it only makes sense to start with how are we as a society going to try and make it through all of the damage and trauma that has taken place after World War I. And that's going to be Warren Harding's return to normalcy. And so we'll start with 16A. And then we have 18C, which is describe the effects of political scandals, including the Teapot Dome and U.S. citizens concerning trust in the federal government and its leaders. So this is important. This will be your second TEK. So you would start with 16A and then you would go to 18C, and that's kind of that progression is going to start with those two. And remember that Teapot Dome is really important because, and I'm going to start going ahead and explaining your TEKs out, but Teapot Dome scandal is really important to focus on because we are going to see scandal after scandal from this point on with our beloved elected officials to some degree or another. And so students are going to have to understand, how do Americans perceive these scandals? This is really the first time where Americans are going to see that they can't necessarily trust their officials. And then, of course, we'll get into other officials and presidencies and stuff like that where we have problems, like Nixon and Clinton. We're going to see, and Reagan, we've got some issues with Reagan. So we're going to see some of these pop up, and this sets the tone. Hey, remember when we were talking about the Teapot Dome scandal? Okay, well, let's look at this scandal. How are they similar? How are they different? How did the people react to this one versus this one? Let's compare and contrast. when you're going to cover 16A, you're really just going to cover Warren Harding's return to normalcy and his idea of reduced taxes, but you're going to come back to reduced taxes later, because in the 1920s, the last thing that we want to cover really is technology, and we want to get into the technology of buying on credit. Because that's going to kind of lead us into the mentality that's going on when we hit the Great Depression and the causes of the Great Depression. So if we can hit those, and we're kind of hinting at it before we leave 1920s, and then here we come into the 30s, and we're going to see some issues with the practices that are taking place in the 20s, it sets us up. And if we can really do this correctly, students won't struggle with the Great Depression and the New Deal as much as they normally do. And if we can start entering in to this concept that the government is stepping in, the government is trying to do things while also navigating the tightrope of what their role is as far as private business, what their role is as far as things that are going on in the world, and how much of a responsibility do they have to get involved and try to mitigate these issues and stuff like that without stepping over their rights as the federal government, or stepping into state rights and disrupting that precious federalism balance that we hope to always have going on. So this is kind of how we enter into the 1920s. Remember, you're also wanting to mention that entering into the 1920s, there's partly the reason that we're talking about return to normalcy is because everything has just been thrown out the window. Okay, these people are coming in. There's a lot of people that died. There's a huge population of boys that died over there in the Great War, and now here we are. And we have a lost generation. And this also is kind of the prelude to the lost generation of the 1960s during Vietnam. You're going to have a large group of people that are going to, there's just going to be this huge shift away from societal norms in the 1920s. And it's really going to be pushed by your younger generation, especially younger generation of women who are pushing against these boundaries of how they're supposed to dress and look and act. The traditional roles of women is what they're going against. And that's how it's tested. Those are the words that are used. And you'll often see a flapper girl. Maybe you'll see a guy kind of dressed as a mobster, but it's always usually going to be a flapper girl because they are going against the traditional Victorian values and Victorian dress. And so they're smoking, they're drinking, they're wearing short clothes, they're being promiscuous, they're hanging out at speakeasies those are your hidden bars, and remember that the 18th Amendment, that's that prior knowledge that we're activating. The 18th Amendment was already passed with the temperance movement. So alcohol is illegal. We have prohibition going on right now. And so with prohibition, we've got a need that needs to be filled, right? We're going to get into the economics here. There's a need, and so someone's going to supply that need, okay? And so it's going to be supplied illegally because there's prohibition going on, and this is going to give rise to the mob. So it always asks, what was one of the effects of prohibition, and the effect was the rise of organized crime. The mob came from this, and of course we'll have innovations like stock cars, which will lead to NASCAR, bootlegged alcohol. Cars need to be fast to transport the alcohol. We're going to have, like I said, those speakeasies were also an effect of prohibition. We'll have the changing roles of women take place. We are also going to be dealing with some social issues outside of prohibition, stuff like that. And also remember that with the Harlem Renaissance taking place, you've got a new form of music going on. And it really is going to take rise in those speakeasies. And that's going to be your jazz music, which is kind of that beginning of rock and roll, which is important to start mentioning anyways, because when we get into the 1950s, we will get into the rock and roll generation. So, but before that, we'll come from this, and we'll rise into kind of that rock and roll generation, to that beat gen, to the hippie concept and stuff like that. So we'll get into all of these different types of really youth-led, youth-pushed movements, cultural movements. But the African Americans are going to be leaving the Deep South to escape. And of course, we always want to remind students that anytime someone migrates or immigrates, it's for 3 reasons, or at least 3 tested reasons. And those reasons are jobs and opportunity and to escape oppression. Those are always the concepts there that people are leaving. That's the blanket push and pull factor, right? If they can go somewhere where they can find jobs, they're going to leave where they're being discriminated against, and they're going to go somewhere better, right? So we're always pushing those push and pull factors. But with this great migration, they're leaving because they're discriminated against in the South, and they're going to go up north where the factory jobs are. They can make money and be less discriminated against. And this is where we're going to get the birth of Harlem. And one of my favorite lessons to do here is to compare Langston Hughes' poem with Tupac's song. And phenomenal. And the kids always love it because it's mind-blowing to them. And they might not even know who Tupac is, but when they listen to the song or they read the lyrics, however you want to do it, they realize that it's rap, and then they're kind of a little more interested. But a great comparison there. And of course, that comparison, like all of the civil rights concepts that we're getting into, is going to lead us into the civil rights era. and into some other SCOTUS cases, which we haven't quite gotten into yet. But upon moving up there, there's going to be a huge explosion of their ethnic pride, and there's going to be an explosion of music and arts and writing and elite thinking. So these top thinkers coming out with concepts and talking about the idea of race relations and stuff like that, it's really going to kind of take movement from this point on and build up quickly. Outside of that, we have immigration issues. So this is really going to be where we see, for one, before I forget, like I forgot, and this is a really great lesson for you. You're going to forget some things while you're teaching, because in that last video, I forgot to mention the Bolshevik Revolution, which takes place during World War I and has been a tested question. So, and of course, it is going to become a problem in the Roaring Twenties when we have the first Red Scare. So there's you a quick lesson. You're going to forget things, okay? But with regard to immigration, before I forget, this reminded me that Native Americans will get their citizenship. So please don't forget that. That has been a tested question, and it's often an overlooked concept when we're getting to the Roaring Twenties, but they do get their citizenship during this time frame. But on the immigration topic, we're also going to see actual quotas. This is where the Quota Act actually takes place. So we were technically operating within the concept of quotas, but there wasn't an actual act for it. So that will be passed during the Roaring Twenties. Speaking of the Bolshevik Revolution that took place in World War I, of course it's important, right? It's important because now Germany starts to do better, right? Because they're not fighting on two fronts. This is the first time that the students are realizing what fronts are. And sometimes the word theater is used, so fighting on multiple theaters. But Germany doesn't have to do that once Russia falls out and is having to deal with their revolution. So now here in the Roaring Twenties, that revolution had taken place, and what we're seeing is communist Russia rise up, the Soviet Union, and we have the Red Scare, where we're going to start pretty much the birth of McCarthyism. Okay, and the Red Scare is the first time that we're going to be looking at specific individuals as far as, oh, you're Russian, are you a communist, are you a commie spy, are you trying to turn people here? We don't want people to grab hold of these concepts and try and push them here in the United States. So we will have the first Red Scare. Social Darwinism. Okay, this is the idea that the rich are rich because they worked really hard, and the poor are poor because they're lazy and genetically inferior. Okay, and it's also going to give rise to eugenics, which is the idea that if you get strong people to mate with strong people and both of the same ethnic background, specifically white European background, so that Western Europe area, that you need to mate and make as many babies as you can and populate the world with this. This is actually the birthplace of kind of the eugenics movement. Hitler actually praised the eugenic movement that had been taking place in the United States. So it really does, this is the movement that started to go around and sterilize women of ethnic backgrounds when they were in surgery or having something going on with them. So it is a huge movement, and of course it's a failure because eugenics doesn't work, but also the idea of sterilizing your children if you feel like they're not strong enough in their mind, they're feeble-minded, and of course there's the famous story of the rich woman who sterilized her daughter without her consent during surgery. So you have plenty that you can pull from here to kind of explain to students what the eugenics movement was really about. Okay, we also have Scopes trial, which is going to be the idea of implementing actual Darwinism into the science classroom. So moving away from creationism and into Darwinism as a theory to be taught in school. And of course, this is going to take place in Tennessee, which is a very fundamentalist state. And actually, most of the country are very fundamentalist Christians, and they're not going to support this movement. So this will be the first, a huge televised trial, and people are going to be talking, and it's called the Scopes monkey trial because people associate Darwinism with people becoming people from monkeys. And so they'll literally be selling like monkeys, little stuffed monkeys outside. You can pull up pictures and stuff from this. It's very, very interesting. And of course, you're going to have Scopes who had made this claim with a businessman. This is not he got caught doing it. It was done on purpose so that they could bring this to the courtroom and start having these conversations about what is okay to talk in school about and what isn't. The ACLU will be coming to Scopes, who is the teacher's defense, and then William Jennings Bryan will become the attorney against him. And so remember, at this time, these William Jennings Bryan is a Democrat. He's a Southern Democrat. So remember, at this time, Southern Democrats are your generally white supremacist backing groups who align themselves with the thinking of fundamental Christianity. So William Jennings Bryan will be the defense attorney, and the prosecution. Clarence Darrow will be in the defense of Scopes. William Jennings Bryan, he is not going to do a great job. He's going to do a pretty terrible job, and he's going to die right after. So this is something that we definitely get into with the kids as far as where is the line drawn with regard to religion in schools. And you have plenty of wonderful SCOTUS cases that you can bring into this, like Wisconsin v. Yoder, which is a religious SCOTUS case. And of course, we recently had a SCOTUS case about prayer in school. So you can bring in these SCOTUS cases and play devil's advocate with them, however you want to do, as long as you don't choose a side. So definitely something that you can do to kind of explain Scopes monkey trial. Let's see, nativism is still a thing. Remember, that's where that quotas comes from. We deserve to be here more than you do because we were born here. Our culture is better. Kind of nativism is always wrapped up in a little bit of xenophobia. So as a way to continue to explain that to people, this is still going on, guys. Prohibition, of course, we talked about that. That was the 18th Amendment, and it will create the changing role, or be part of creating that changing role of women and the mob and speakeasies and everything that comes from Prohibition. And then it'll connect with the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance that comes from that. Let's see. 26A. So just remind them again that steel production is going to bring on the skyscrapers. We're going to see a lot of inventions coming in the 1920s. But really, aside from skyscrapers and stock cars, you have planes, and that's going to be Charles Lindbergh. You can also bring in Amelia Earhart. We have the assembly line, so that's really going to bring in that concept of the free enterprise system. Henry Ford is able to open up his factory, and he's able to make cars quicker and more affordable through the assembly line. And so that is, it's an economics question. Sometimes it's tested as a timeline, but it's really just bringing on like how that assembly line came about, or it'll be like a line and it'll explain how he was making more money. How is that? Well, because he was able to output more quicker cars and make them more affordable because people could buy them from the assembly line. So there's that one. And then, of course, we're going to have credit. And that, like I said before, it leads us into the Great Depression, people buying on credit. And you can even start to mention in the 1920s, to save yourself time in the Great Depression, that people are buying on credit, but they're not just buying things like an ironing board or an oven or a stove or a fridge or something like that. They're buying things like stock, okay? And this is going to, of course, lead into speculation and stuff like that, and buying on margin. So if you can talk about speculation and buying on margin in the 1920s, right towards the end of the 1920s, then you can set yourself up to go into the causes of the Great Depression and to really dive in and make sure your kids know the causes, because that's the hardest thing for them to understand, is the economic side of the cause of the Great Depression. So if you can start that in the Roaring '20s and then slowly make your way into it and then really dive in the Great Depression, then you're going to hound in this concept into students' brains. Okay, so then we have 16A. We already talked about that one. So 6A, we talked about those. 13A. And we talked about that. So that's pretty much everything. I think that one of the biggest disconnects for the Roaring '20s is always that there's a lot of things going on, and they're not necessarily all interconnected. There might be little slivers of things that you can connect with each other, but I think that's generally where people struggle with the 1920s. The hardest thing to hone in on students with is the economic and government topics. So the things that are setting up these students for senior year are the things that they struggle with the most. I mean, there's a reason that kids don't go into economics and government until they're seniors. They're a little more mature. They're a little more able to focus in, and they should have those critical thinking skills to better understand the topics that are going on. But it's our job to really kind of lay those foundations so these senior teachers aren't having to work as hard to explain them, and they can go into more depth with the topics. So 1920s, I hope that helps and kind of explains how you would go about going through these topics.